I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we are two political science professors who have just watched episode 7 of the Apple TV series Pluribus, episode 7 called The Gap. Jeff, I found this a very rich, sort of brave episode. I watched it twice to be sure I was kind of understanding what's going on there. I think this is a highly kind of conceptual episode. I think we're presented with a dualism between Carol and Manusus Oviedo, and that's what the episode is structured around. And the dualism presents them having, paired experiences of road trips, encounters with society, so on and so forth. And we're meant to see these as very different experiences that expose a fundamental difference, not just between these two people as individuals, but between sort of the worlds that they inhabit.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's think about the title of the episode, The Gap. So last week I had wondered, and we had sort of wondered collectively, how is it exactly that Oviedo is going to get through the Darien Gap? And it turns out, well, he's actually not going to get through it. And so on one hand, the title is a literal reference, it seems to me, to the Darien Gap. But on the other hand, it's exactly what you say. It's a reference to this kind of compare and contrast exercise that the storytelling this week is doing. It's the gap or the distance between two very different lived and, I think, culturally based experiences that take the form of the characters of Oviedo and Carol. And I think this week's episode makes it even more obvious than I think that you and I believe that it has been up to this point, that on one hand, this is a show that means to explore the imagined personality characteristics of fictional people, right? And attempts to fill in people like Carol or Diabate or Oviedo, and to imagine them as sort of full-bodied personalities.
But that's not its primary register.
But on the other hand, what we have both believed that is happening in this show, and as I say, I think it's most obvious this week, is that these are characters who are meant to be archetypes. They are meant to be symbols of larger dynamics. They're meant to be stand-ins in a certain way for other kinds of themes. And I think this week's explicit compare and contrast between Oviedo's journey and Carol's journey makes that exceedingly obvious.
Yeah, and the way I read it, I think all that's right. I think that they're supposed to be vectors or avatars for broader ideas. And that's not to say that you cannot read the show as one of kind of psychological realism and literary fiction and have great sympathy for Carol or for Manusus or great animosity towards either of them. You can any reading is plausible, and especially in a show that's as multivalenced as this one, it can support multiple readings at the same time. But I think our primary thought for the show as a whole, and especially for this week, is to read it more at the level of the characters being avatars. And the primary frame, I thought, is that Carol this week is supposed to be an avatar for the experience of the developed, or what used to be called the first world.
Wealthy, developed world.
Yeah, and Manusus Oviedo is supposed to be an avatar or a vector for the experience of the developing world. And you have these series of paired experiences that are compared and contrasted throughout the episode, beginning with a road trip. But both of them start being on a road trip. Carol is coming back from Las Vegas to her home in New Mexico. Now, why is that significant? And we're reminded of that. Obviously that was last week's episode. She'd gone to see Diabate. We're reminded by the road sign that she's coming from Las Vegas. So what is Las Vegas? In Carol's own terms, It's like a light up ashtray.
Right.
I was also reminded of the theorist Baudrillard, who talks about kind of the nature of reality in a hyper-developed, hyper-modern or postmodern country. And he uses the example of Disneyland versus America. And he says the point of Disneyland, which is this, the kind of exemplification of the hyper-real simulation that there's nothing real behind, that's absurdist, essentially. The point of Disneyland is not to be an escape from America. It's a mind trick or a head fake.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to think that America is real and reasonable because you've seen Disneyland as absurd. But in fact, Disneyland is kind of koshering, I guess, if that's an appropriate word to use, the rest of America. You're told this is the absurd thing, therefore the America you live in is is real and reasonable. But in fact, America is an extension of Disneyland. Well, Las Vegas, I think, is fulfilling that role in Carol's journey. We're meant to see her as coming back to reality, but in fact, she's bringing the absurdity of Las Vegas out in, it's escaped out into, as it always already was, out into the entirety of the America, which again could be any hyper-developed, quote-unquote, first world country.
Yeah, I think that's a sharp reading of what's happening and of the placement of Las Vegas and in where it is placed in the narrative. For me, my reference point here is a little earthier, I suppose. I go to Hunter Thompson's work, and particularly his very well-known book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and where he writes that Las Vegas is the literal nerve center of the American dream. And what he means is it's not that he means to contrast, I don't think, the hyper-reality of Las Vegas with the real, or the imagined hyper-reality with the real, but rather his point is that the hyper-reality that is presented in Las Vegas is in fact the real. And that this is why for him, the grotesquerie of Las Vegas is actually redolent and indicative of the grotesquerie kind of at the heart of that American vision of unrestrained freedom.
Yeah, I think we're actually saying the same thing, or maybe Baudrillard and Hunter S. Thompson was saying the same thing.
Saying the same things, probably on different substances at the time when they said them. But I think that's right? And so it's important that Carol is leaving Las Vegas, so to speak, but doing so with a kind of a renewed sense of the limitless or license type characters of a certain version of freedom, which are the stock in trade in a place like Las Vegas.
Well, and so for the rest of the episode, Carol, again, as an avatar for, I don't know, first world hyper-privileged decadence, rather than it's not meant to be a character critique of a real person, known as Carol. But as that kind of exemplification, she then behaves in incredibly decadent, sort of abusive, hyper entitled ways throughout the rest of the episode.
She's given up.
Yeah.
It's clear that she had imagined that in last week's episode, she had discovered the motivating element, the thing that was going to get the other survivors on board to join her in this, what might be a kind of quixotic attempt to save the world. And so she goes to Diabate, and he not only already knows about HDP, he actually has concluded that this is leading him to a greater position of sympathy for the Pluribus rather than evidence of their horror. And so that's part of what's happening here, right? Is that it seems to me that the narrative is setting up a fatalistic position that Carol is in, and the way that precisely because of the sort of highly wealthy and developed first world culture in which she finds herself and in which she's placed, her fatalism looks in a very particular sort of way. And it looks like, stealing golf carts and playing golf. And it looks like, stealing lottery tickets and rubbing them off until you get a winner just because that's enjoyable and an ego boost, not because it means anything. It means stealing a whole load of fireworks and just blowing them up all the time. Like, what is more of a monument to privilege than being able to buy a bunch of explosives and not use them for any meaningful purpose, but you just make pretty colors in the sky.
But the ideological or social critique embodied here is not that.
And by the way, I love fireworks. So
yes, it's not that Carol has. It's not that Carol has given up and is now behaving abnormally or irresponsibly. Right? The ideological critique would be these are actually the characteristic behaviors of people who live
fatalism in this sort of environment
in first world countries, right? So it's a sort of an auto critique of elites by elites, or of the privileged by the privileged.
And this
right?
gets us to the point we had talked about off camera. I know that you wanted to say something about is the placement of Carol's singing. Right. And it's really the song that she chooses, the first of, I think I counted a half dozen songs that she kind of returns to that are related in one way or another to whatever the context is in which she finds herself. But the first one is REM's It's the End of the World as We Know It. And the scene cuts off as she is about to say and I feel fine. It cuts off at the I feel, which means it a little bit ambivalent about how she feels. But I know that you picked up on this as well, and you had a particular sort of sense of why that song in particular is helpfully illuminating.
Well, I think REM's "The End of the World" as we know it could be seen as a. I think it was probably in Vince Gilligan's mind as he's writing the show. I think it can be seen as a musical sort of key to what's going on in the show as a whole. So it's a gloriously kind of a self-contradictory song. Just take the title, right? It's the end of the world as we know it. That's going off in one direction towards apocalypse,
and then in parentheses,
and I feel fine, which is going off in another direction. So you've got all these contrasts or counterpoints. The different valence of of catastrophe versus satisfaction. The world historical, it's the end of the world, and the individual's feelings, and I feel fine. All of that's going on in Pluribus. The song itself, Michael Stipe's lyrics are this sort of stream of consciousness, postmodern tour of a variety of maladies which are afflicting first world society, some of which are natural and sort of plausible as the end of the world, others of which are just absurd things that are, and the impression you get both from the way the music is performed, the way the lyrics are delivered, but also the content of the lyrics is an individual being sort of borne in upon by a constant flow of just stuff, some of which is TV culture, some of which is geopolitics, some of which is it's all just kind of crowding in on the person. And the other thing that's going on, the sort of contrapuntal nature of the song lyrically is matched by the vocal delivery, or the dueling vocal deliveries. There's this concept, Jeff, I know you know this, called polysephony, or contrapuntal.
I know it now.
Because I told you about it. And amazingly, Wikipedia also knows it, so draw your own conclusions. But I didn't know the word, but I'd come across it in a number of other songs where you have a dominant melody that's then matched with a counter melody. And it works brilliantly in the end of the world as we know it, because it's expressing the contradictory sentiments of and stakes of the song. So while Michael Stipe, particularly towards the end of the song, is singing "It's the end of the world as we know it," the Mike Mills, the backing vocalist, is singing "It's time I had some time alone." Right. So the end of the world is actually an affordance of a person for a person who's borne in upon by these postmodern, hyper-real, hyper-information society maladies. An affordance of some time to be alone and some time to think, and that's why they feel fine, because you're getting this time alone. And I think that's a master key not only for this episode but also for particularly Carol's condition.
I think
in the series as a whole.
I think that's a really sharp insight, and it also just doubles back upon what we were saying earlier. So the I feel fine, right? The ability to retreat into isolation ends up being a position that one can take only because they exist in a privileged enough situation that it is okay to retreat, that it is possible to retreat. It is possible to remove oneself from the overwhelming, hyperreality, so to speak, that they are experiencing. And contrast that, for example, with our other main character who's on screen this week, Oviedo.
Yeah. What's the phrase? First world problems? Is that still the phrase people use? To things that are not existential difficult. Instacart didn't deliver the right tortillas for me. I wanted whole wheat and they gave me.
Yeah.
Is it first world problems?
I believe
is that
so.
the phrase people still use?
The commenters will tell us.
Yeah, I guess so.
Oviedo is not really in a position where he can feel fine about the end of the world.
No, it's existential for him. And his road trip, Carol's is from Las Vegas to America, so from absurdity to absurdity, in the reading of the show. His is from a developing country to the US, and it's I know I think we both picked up on this, but it's sort of explicitly a migrant story. And that's what the show is trying to tell us about Oviedo's, or is trying to have Oviedo's journey symbolized, within the register of the show for us.
And just the way you were talking about this in particular off camera, the way that the two of them conduct their road trip while they're driving, right? Consider what happens when they run out of gasoline and how they approach it. Carol pulls into a gasoline station and she calls up the Pluribus, says, "Turn on pump one," right? Oviedo is presented with he could do the same thing. In fact, they're the Pluribus is sort of periodically demanding that he accept their help, and
They're not as scared of him as they are of her, or as...
because he just ignored. Like he
Right.
has full contempt for them, but not in the kind of emotional way, I suppose, that we have seen apparently affects them so much. So how does he get gasoline? Well, he siphons it from abandoned cars, and then, even in spite of the fact that they're abandoned, he leaves money under their windshield so as to compensate them. And we've seen him do this before. He did this with the self-storage units that he had to break into, right? He would leave money behind, or a note that says, I will compensate you for this. And how does his road trip proceed? I mean, Carol's just kind of driving. Carol's journey from Las Vegas it's all good road. I think it's probably all the same road, or at least very similar road, whereas Oviedo's, he's constantly got to refer to the map, right? And he goes through a whole variety of different kinds of circumstances. Sometimes the roadways are very developed. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes he's in, relatively developed cities like Quito in Ecuador, and sometimes he's not. And then eventually he comes, in fact, to the Darien Gap, the thing we were wondering how he was going to manage to pass. He comes to it, it's the end of the road, literally. And what does he discover at the end of the road? He discovers the discarded detritus of previous migrants who have come to a place where they've had to discard what they're carrying because they can't any longer go on, because the Darien Gap has become, over the last decade in particular, sort of one of the primary route through which migrants have attempted to come north. There's an entire sort of infrastructure, underground illegal infrastructure, black market infrastructure, so to speak, around those trails of migrants and around those paths. And that is what Oviedo is confronted with. And so, I mean, this symbolism here seems undeniably true, that what has happened is that Oviedo is now a migrant.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
The road trip has become less the kind of mythologized, fantasized trip where you hop in the car and you just light off off for a better world. Now he has explicitly become a migrant, and he's got a backpack, and he's prepared himself. Right. He's got his machete. He's got ways to make fire. He has what he needs, he thinks, to get through the Darien Gap.
Right.
And he's confronted by Pluribus members who are pleading with him not to do this.
Well, so again, you have these parallels, right? You've got the road trips and where they're going from and to. You've got the way that they sort of interact with the Pluribus in their guise as, I guess, service workers, right? Carol is, I'm sorry, but abusive, and extremely sort of entitled, like, bring me a chilled drink and you didn't do it right, and then next time do better. And Oviedo's, Manusus is just rejectionist. He just won't, very sort of survivalist or individualist, just won't engage with them. Their different attitudes towards money. Carol has the money is to her, as it would be in reality. And again, you can read this situation as a realistic one if you like. We're not going to deny anyone else's readings, but money is to her an irrelevance. She wins the lottery and she doesn't even care. It doesn't matter at all. Whereas Manusus, as you say, is sort of extremely sort of austere and wants to be right with the people that he's taking things from. And then they get them. You have this parallel that you'd started to allude to between their experiences of the sort of natural world.
Yeah.
And Manusus's experiences in the Darien Gap, and it's of the natural world as an existential threat toward the achievement of his goals, which from his perspective are absolutely necessary to the continuation of his life as a worthwhile sort of pursuit. What is Carol's encounter in the natural world in this episode? She plays golf. I know you like golf. I don't play golf, so if you like golf, I'm sorry about this, but I think you can read golf within the context of this episode as a sort of wasteful use of abundant natural resources, right? If we're talking about the natural world, there's all this land that you kind of...
Well, there's wilderness and garden theme going on here.
Yeah.
Golf is maybe useful for that garden type element.
But it's a theme park of nature, right? Golf.
In the same way that a garden, highly cultivated garden, is a theme park of the wilderness.
Right.
Right.
And
which is not what one confronts in the Darien.
Yes. But it's a very... it's a, if your confrontation with nature, there's two confrontations with nature in the show, one of which is the confrontation of the underprivileged, which is nature as an existential barrier and literally red in tooth and claw. The other is the confrontation of the privileged, which is it's this highly cultivated kind of leisure activity. And when the natural world and the natural world in Carol's experience is starting to reassert itself as the overcultivation, or some might say abuse of nature, is receding because humanity is no longer doing the type of things that lead you to transform a ton of land into golf courses. Again, I'm sorry if you like golf. So what does Carol see on the golf course? Is she sees a rabbit there and a buffalo is kind, because they're not constantly being kind of driven out of these spaces by traffic and cultivation and development and so forth.
And the other thing we do know that is intruding in Albuquerque and has come pretty quickly is, I mean, the wolves.
Yeah, and you hear them howl again.
And the coyotes are howling, right? They're coming back, right?
Right. They also have paired experiences with, I didn't know quite how to characterize this, but with society, or the notion of society.
Yeah.
So Carol goes through a series of experiences as part of her exercising her newfound freedom and her newfound willingness to make use of the resources of Pluribus supply to her, or just available.
Left behind.
Yeah, where she starts to appropriate things that are properly in the social realm for purely individual experiences, right? So she goes to the George O'Keeffe Museum and takes, the
painting.
Yeah, and I think it's actually supposed to be her most famous, almost expensive, but I think it's called Jinsen something. I looked it up before, and someone will tell us in the comments. But she has the poster version or whatever in her home, and she's like, I'll just have the real one. Yeah. So taking the social and making it individual. Yeah. She arranges for herself to eat out in a beautiful restaurant, but of course she's the only person there. People have to tell us in the comments, or maybe you can tell us now how they read that restaurant or that experience, which was a recapitulation of the experiences she'd had with Helen, right? All the food was significant. I read it ghoulish, to be honest, but nonetheless, it was that restaurant should be a social experience that she's now experiencing kind of individually. The music comes from the literal self-playing piano, which seems sort of symbolically kind of rich.
And the fireworks, right? Those are civic. That's, fireworks display on 4th of July is a very important civic experience in a lot of American communities. Right. And so, but she's experiencing that individually.
Yeah, individually. Whereas Manusus is his sort of reaching out to wider society is trying to learn English.
Yeah.
So if you take the thematic of the show that we think, the episode, that we think we found, the kind of immigrant's journey, he's sort of painstakingly accommodating himself to the culture that he hopes to join. Right.
But he's not accommodating himself at all to the Pluribus.
No.
And so this is worth, I think, highlighting. So they are both, Carol and Oviedo, are both contemptuous of the Pluribus. But Oviedo's contempt is so profound that he literally seeks to not engage with them at all. And, the scene in which he responds to the sort of the different members who are imploring him not to go into the Darien Gap and saying, we will help you. We can get you to New Mexico by tonight, and we can take your car too. We know how much that matters to you. And I think it's really important when he says to them, you don't belong here. Nothing here is yours. You stole it all. And then what is his refrain as he's stumbling through the Darien Gap? I am not one of them. He's not accommodating him. He's not willing to accommodate himself to the Pluribus. Carol is, right? Carol is willing to, as you say, sort of eventually and haltingly take advantage of their service-like elements.
Yeah.
Oviedo does everything that he possibly can to avoid it. And the only reason, as maybe we're going to get to now, the only reason that he accepts the help is because he almost certainly physically, medically cannot refuse it.
Right, but just one point before we get there, because I think it's important. When I say he's accommodating himself to the wider culture, I didn't mean to the Pluribus, right? I meant to English-speaking culture as it exists in what is now the United States and the hyper-developed country. And when you were, if you accept, or if you believe that it's plausible that there is this kind of migrant story or developed world and developing world thing going on, you know, when Manusus says nothing here belongs to you and you stole it all,
Mm-hmm.
who is he actually saying it to? He's not saying it ideologically to the pluribus, right? He's saying it to the quote unquote first world, or the, you know, in academic terms, it would be sort of this is the kind of settler colonialist critique, right, of kind of post-imperialist countries.
Yeah, and it's right, and it's dramatized by things like, in this week's episode, by things like Carol just taking the Georgia O'Keeffe painting and appropriating it for herself.
Yeah.
Right? Which harkens back to the sort of long history of looting art, right? Which, you know, rich cultures looting, or powerful cultures looting the art of others.
Right.
This becomes a kind of a stand-in for that as well.
Well, and then she's, you know, as the episode develops, the golf that she plays is she's vandalizing her own hyper-developed culture, right? She's literally launching golf, you know, it's so rich that literally launching golf balls into the windows of kind of high-rise buildings. And that also, I think, is if you were minded to read this as an allegory of highly developed societies in general, or maybe America in particular, you've got a number of things going on here where these societies are so sort of rich and kind of satisfied that they actually start eating themselves. They start destroying themselves. So Carol smashing windows in a high-rise building, literally firing fireworks off around the place. And at one point, let's say Carol is an avatar for, I don't know, contemporary America or the hyper-developed society. At one point, the firework literally points itself at her own head. And she's sort of indifferent to it. You know, I mean, talk about an allegory for what may or may not be going on in one or several countries at the moment.
That's also the trigger, right, for her to decide that she's going to call for help.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And well, do you want to take a quick break and we'll come back to it? Yes. Okay, so we will be right back in just 1 second. And we are back with our analysis of episode 7 of Pluribus, and we wanted to talk about the ways in which Carol and Manusus, you know, having got into trouble, sort of express their need for help.
Mm-hmm. I do think it's important that when the firework is pointed at Carol's head, she doesn't care. She's got tons of time to react, to point it in another direction, to move herself, and she doesn't. She doesn't care. And so we do know that at this point, and this has been more than a month, I think. The timeline, the chronology here is a little hazy, but it's been more than a month at this point that Carol has been back from Las Vegas. She does seem like she's reached the end of her string. And so she doesn't care if the firework hits her in the head and kills her at this point. It barely misses her, it whizzes by her head. But that appears to be the trigger for her to put the fire out, right, in the neighboring house first, and then the next day to paint the help sign that eventually brings Zoja.
Well, and this is the episode, I think, telling us at this point it shifts a little bit from treating these characters relentlessly as avatars for larger themes, and maybe snaps a little bit into, okay, this is now a Carol story.
Right. Gets us a little bit more back into whatever the specifics of her personality has been drawn as up to this point. Oviedo, on the other hand, again, steadfastly at all points not only refuses the help of the pluribus, but is contemptuous of it. And it's only after he, you know, suffers, a shocking number of like kind of, you know, spines to the back from from the palm, and only after he's done this brutal kind of cauterization, right, of the wounds to prevent the bacteria and infection from seeping in, his body literally gives out. And at that point, the pluribus, which has clearly been monitoring him in the same ways that a lot of migrants are monitored with high-tech, you know, law enforcement as they are working their way through not so much the Darien Gap, but through like the Sonoran Desert further north, they've clearly been monitoring Manusus the entire time, and they come to his aid, presumably, which we know he would refuse if he were physically capable of it. So both of them, as you say, end up in these positions where they end up needing the help of the pluribus, but the way that they submit to that need for help is, again, seems to be highly dependent or redolent, again, of the kind of the cultural differences that create the context in which their journeys are taking place.
Yeah, although ultimately, and this is a common, you know, theme in science fiction, that whatever the cultural differences, there's a shared there are shared traits of humanity, right? So maybe what the show is telling us at this point is, however different their circumstances, and I think we both believe that if Carol, was in Manusus's, had grown up in Manusus's culture, and Manusus had grown up in Carol's culture, that it's not the individual, right?
Yeah.
It's the way that
that's the point of the show.
Yeah, that circumstances play upon individuals, and therefore you should recognize individuals who are different from yourself as having an ultimate human sympathy, because ultimately, however individualistic Manusus and Carol are in their own very different and perhaps culturally shaped ways, that they do need, that you're still a social creature, right? You still need some kind of help, and maybe that's what the show is trying to tell us there. The show ends with a version of Age of Aquarius. The Age of Aquarius is it was a famous sort of song from the 70s?
No, it's
60s.
The hippies.
Yeah, so 60s.
Yeah,
but anyway, the
late 60s.
The notion of the Age of Aquarius is this kind of astrological notion that we exist in ages that are defined by astrological things, and the Age of Aquarius will be this notion, this sort of time of great unity and love and fellow feeling, which again, very, very clever sort of musical choice. Jeff, I think we have put on the table 95% of the most controversial issues in contemporary society. So. So nothing really to...
Only 5%.
Yeah, to come next week.
Yes.
But still really loving the show, finding it really provocative. I appreciated your company and your expertise again this week,
Always.
Jeff. And on that bombshell,